Hi, my name is Steve Myers. At the last conference I reported on some research that showed how political orientation shapes the reality we experience along a superior-inferior axis. It's a sort of psychological equivalent of the Doppler effect, where the pitch is higher or lower depending on your standpoint. The research I'm presenting now looks at a related aspect, participation mystique. It is an unconscious identity in which our attitudes towards disparate policies tend to become more aligned as we develop more political knowledge and a clearer political orientation. The hypothesis I'm testing is that the more someone identifies with a political standpoint and the more they know about politics, then the more their views will align with those of a similar identity. To do this, I used a short self-report questionnaire that asked people to identify their level of political knowledge and then answer 4 questions. The first question asked for their political orientation on a 7-point scale between extreme left and extreme right. The other 3 asked for their views on disparate policies relating to pay, status and decision making. The answers that I expected to align were alternated on each side to avoid a response bias. I had nearly 3,000 responses and then conducted various types of analyses for each level of political knowledge. The first analysis looked at the correlations between political orientation and each of the policy areas. For the first group of people, who said they had no political knowledge, there were no correlations. For those who knew something about politics, there were some slight correlations, all around the 0.1 to 0.2 range. But for those who knew a lot about politics, some clearer correlations emerge, all around the 0.3 to 0.4 range, and all in the same expected direction. So when we consider all 3 graphs together, they seem to suggest that as knowledge of politics increases, attitudes to disparate policy areas tend to align around an overall political orientation. To examine this from a different perspective, I then undertook some cluster analysis. I'm not an expert in this technique, but it is well suited for this study because participation mystique is an unconscious clustering of attitudes around a particular identity. There are several problems with this technique, one of which is the degree of subjectivity involved. It is a bit like looking at a nighttime satellite image of the UK and saying, where are the major conurbations? It isn't a test as such. Cluster analysis is more of a heuristic to help discover patterns in the data. This dendrogram shows how the software produces clusters. The horizontal axis at the top comprises all the individuals in the group. The software starts from the top and works down, putting people into the most similar group it can find, or putting similar groups together until it gets to the bottom when we have just one group. The length of the vertical lines indicates how dissimilar the groups are when they are put together. When there are long lines, that's probably where the clusters are. In this diagram, there are 3 long lines highlighted in red, which suggests 3 clusters. Though the picture's a bit unclear in the middle, where the dotted yellow lines are. They might suggest there are perhaps 4 or even 5 clusters. However, there is another problem that we need to consider. Cluster analysis can sometimes find patterns in data that aren't actually there. So are these clusters merely an artifact of the technique? One way to find out is to use a Monte Carlo procedure. In a Monte Carlo procedure, we replace the real data with randomized data and compare the dendrograms. In the Monte Carlo dendrogram on the right, the long line suggests there are 5 clusters in the randomized data. When I did the analysis for those people who know something about politics, the lines in the real data become relatively longer than the Monte Carlo version. These lines more clearly suggest there are 2 or possibly 3 clusters. When I did the analysis for the group who know a lot about politics, the lines get longer again. The dendrogram suggests there are 2 or possibly 3 clusters, which looks increasingly unlikely to be a random result. Another problem with cluster analysis is that the results can be influenced by population size or population bias. So far, I've been looking at everybody who responded to the questionnaire. To see if the population might have had an impact on the results, I repeated the cluster analyses using a randomly selected balanced population. I used a spreadsheet to randomly select an equal number of each political orientation on the 7-point scale from left to right and an equal number for each of the 3 levels of political knowledge. For the first balanced group, who know nothing about politics, the real data and the Monte Carlo data are still quite similar. However, there's just a hint of a difference. The lines are slightly longer in the real data and they perhaps suggest 3 clusters, whereas the Monte Carlo data suggests 4. For the group that knows something about politics, the differences in the length of the lines between the two sides again become a bit more pronounced. However, the cluster analysis for the real data now suggests there are probably just 2 clusters. For the group of people who know a lot about politics, the differences become even more pronounced. This suggests there are probably just 2 clusters, though again with a hint of a third. I then did one last cluster analysis by putting all the balanced groups back together, including all levels of political knowledge. There isn't a massive difference between the real data and the Monte Carlo data, but there is a difference. So, putting all these dendrograms together, it seems to confirm the message from the correlations. The views of people who have very little knowledge are not aligned. However, as they differentiate a political standpoint, they tend to align their views on disparate policies towards 2 main clusters. The software allows us to choose the number of clusters, and it will then allocate each individual case to a cluster. We can then see what the characteristics of the clusters are. As the differences seem to become clearer for those who have a lot of political knowledge, I focused this analysis just on that group. I converted their responses into z-scores, and assuming there are 2 clusters, calculated the averages. For cluster 1, all the z-score averages are positive. They are in the category that one might conventionally associate with the right wing of politics. All the averages in cluster 2 are negative, which are in the direction of the left wing. In the dendrograms, there was a hint of there being 3 clusters for this group, so I repeated the analysis for 3 clusters to see what might happen. With 3 clusters, the first right wing cluster is exactly the same. The left wing cluster is still there, but some of those people have been split off into another cluster. This is politically nearer the centre because for identity, pay and status, the average z-scores are much nearer 0 than the right and left wing groups. However, for the question about who makes decisions, by those in authority or by consensus, the new centre group is slightly more committed to consensus than those who remain in the left wing group. Given the degree of subjectivity in cluster analysis, I decided to do one more test, a chi-square. I counted the number of people for whom the z-scores were all to the left of the mean and also those all to the right. I then looked to see if a difference emerged as people differentiate their political standpoint. The first column indicates what would happen at random. Rather than work it out mathematically, I conducted 50 Monte Carlo procedures and took the average. In chi-square, there is a significant difference between the Monte Carlo result and the group who declared they had no knowledge of politics. That probably suggests they did have a bit of knowledge. In fact, chi-square suggested there was no significant difference between those who said they had no knowledge and those who said they had some. However, there is a significant difference between those who have some knowledge and those who have a lot. We can visualize these numbers with this graph. The tall grey bars show the number of people whose answers were a mix of left and right, or whose political identity was in the centre. The red bars show people whose answers were all to the left. The blue bars show people whose answers were all to the right. We can see in the final set of columns that when people develop more political knowledge, they tend to move from the centre more towards one side or the other. It isn't a dramatic effect, but it is a tendency. Combined with my research into ontological relativity, that is, how reality changes according to the political orientation we take, this suggests that the more we differentiate a political standpoint, through increasing knowledge and identification with one side of the political spectrum or the other, then the more our attitudes and realities align. This in turn increases the degree of political polarisation. There are lots of caveats that need to be added to this research because, for example, this has been a simple piece of research that hasn't looked at the effect of different types of political knowledge. However, it raises several implications, questions and potential concerns to investigate further. For example, there are some analysts who believe that greater knowledge leads to a deconstruction of political views. That is, we take different views on disparate policies. This research suggests it works the other way around. As we increase our political knowledge, our views tend to become more aligned through our identification with a political orientation. In practical terms, this could mean that the internet and social media are feeding our polarisation even without the complication of fake news. As information becomes more accessible, it has unconsciously encouraged us to align our views in more polarised ways. This has implications for policy and communication of policy because it somehow has to bridge the differing realities that are emerging in our increasing polarised and antagonistic political worlds. Thank you for listening.